Welcome to my channel, a safe place where we can dive into the strange and mysterious, true crime, makeup, and chill, with new videos every Tuesday.
Warning, viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. This is our safe space to talk true crime while I do my makeup at the same time. But I'm not even gonna hold you, sis. Today's story is nightmare fuel. It's highly disturbing and we're covering some pretty gruesome details. So please, if that ain't your vibe, tap out now and I'll see you in the next one. All right? Love ya. Now, today I'm going to be doing Halloween makeup because it's the month of Halloween. We've got cobwebs, we've got spiders, and we got this face. Just so you know, I am wearing a top, okay? Let me show you. See? Top. Not naked. Oh my god. So I went for a walk today and the hill that I climbed up was humongosaurus. It was like this. It was like climbing up a rock wall. It was wild. And I come home, I was meant to record this. I think I got a little sunstroke because it's about 30 degrees here in Adelaide, Australia. And yeah, I passed out on the couch. I woke up, I had a migraine. I'm telling you, when I seen my car in that car park of the conservation park, I was so happy. I could have cried. I ran out of water. It was a whole thing. I do not advise ever doing the trail that I did on your own, okay? Especially that one. That wrecked me. I was so scared. All right, picture this. It's a cold November day in 1957. So Bernice Worden, the local hardware store owner, yeah, well, she's gone total MIA. Her son's like, yo, I think Ed Gein, that creepy dude who just bought antifreeze, might be involved. The cops are like, all right, let's check it out. And they head over to Gein's farm. When they step inside his house, they're hit with this crazy, awful smell that nearly makes them vom. And what they find next is highly disturbing. Wait, I don't even know if that's the right word to be using. Like disturbing just seems too innocent. Let's just say this is gonna stick with them for the rest of their lives and freak everyone out across the whole country. Let's set the scene, right? So Plainfield, Wisconsin in the 1950s, it's a chill little town where everyone knows everyone. Just outside of town is Ed Gein's farmhouse, all by itself and looking pretty ordinary. Ed was that quirky handyman that, you know, he'd do random jobs fixing stuff around town, and people thought that he was a bit odd and maybe not the sharpest tool in the shed. But he was always polite. Honestly, no one really paid much attention to him. But if those people could have peeked behind the farmhouse door, they'd be totally shook. The outside was hiding some seriously messed up stuff. Everyday life for Ed looked pretty normal for a farmer, but what no one knew is that when he got home, he was living in a twisted nightmare of his own making. As you may imagine, walking up to that farmhouse, it's not just the overgrown yard and the peeling paint that gets you, it's this whole weird ass vibe. Like something's not quite right. A funky smell just hanging in the air. How did nobody notice something was off? Well, Plainfield people were all just about keeping to themselves. They'd whisper about how Ed was a little strange, but no one wanted to dig too deep. He was Augusta Gein's kid, and everyone remembered her for being super strict and religious. So what was really going on behind that farmhouse door? If you stepped inside, you'd notice the clutter everywhere. But as your eyes got used to the dim light, you'd see stuff that send chills down your spine. Like there in the corner, a lampshade, not your usual fabric kind, one made from strange, sticky material. And that's just the start. There were chairs covered in the same material. Get this, they even found a belt that again was made out of that same freaking sticky material. But what was it? First of all, let's take a closer look into this weird Ed bloke. He's something you see in horror movies, like main character energy and not the good type either. Edward Theodore Gein was born August 27th, 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He had an older brother named Harry. His father was George Philip Gein and a mother named Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Home life was never smooth sailing for his mother, Augusta, as his father, George, was a bad alcoholic. And because of this, he struggled to hold down a job. He tried everything. George was a carpenter, tanner, and I'm assuming not like a fake tanner either, you know? I don't think they existed then. And even an insurance man. During his time in La Crosse, Ed's father even owned a local grocery shop, but soon sold the business and moved the Gein family out of the city in 1915 when Ed was only 9 years old to live on an isolated 155-acre farm in Plainfield. So they're living on this new farm, right? Cool. Well, Ed and Henry, they were only allowed to leave this farm to attend school. Outside of school, he spent most of his time doing chores around the farm. Although he was a quiet, shy boy, the teachers and students at his school would say that he had very strange and unusual behaviors. Like he'd be just sitting there, right? And then randomly just start laughing as if he was laughing at his own personal jokes. But wait a second. I do that too, but on camera. On April 1st, 1940, George, Ed's father, died of heart failure at the age of 66. This meant that Ed and his brother now had to pick up slack and bring in money for their living expenses. The community considered the Gein Boys as reliable and honest. I mean, that's good, right? You know how I mentioned earlier that Ed was a handyman? Well, because of his reliableness and his honestness, okay, I'm just making up words now, right? But Ed was trusted to look after the neighbors' children. He was. For money, of course. They would pay him to do so. Now, Henry started dating a divorced mum with 2 kids and was planning to move in with her. He was kind of worried about how attached Ed was to their mum and often trash talked her around Ed, who was pretty hurt by it. Then on May 16, 1944, Ed was out burning marsh plants on their property when things got a little out of hand. The fire had gotten so big that there was fire everywhere, smoke everywhere, and the fire department had to come and help out. This is the unusual part. After the firefighters left, Ed reported Henry missing. So a search party grabbed some lanterns and flashlights to look for 43-year-old Henry, only to find him lying face down. He'd apparently been dead for a while, and it looked like heart failure was the cause, just like his dad. He wasn't burned or hurt otherwise. But here's where it gets sketchy. Biographer Harold Schechter later mentioned that Henry had some bruises on his head. The police brushed off any foul play, and the country coroner ended up saying asphyxiation. Asphyxiation was the cause of death. They went with the accident theory, but no real investigation happened, and there wasn't even an autopsy. Okay, let's talk about Ed Gein's mum, Augusta. This lady was basically the mastermind behind his whole messed up life. She was super religious, like made the local priest look like he was ready to hit the clubs kind of religious. Augusta was all about doom and gloom, hammering home fire and brimstone Bible stories instead of the nicer ones. She straight up told Ed that all women were just sin machines, except for her, of course. Augusta had Ed and his brother Henry on total lockdown. No friends, no fun, just endless farm chores and Bible study. Ed totally adored his mum. Even though he was scared of her, he practically worshipped her, which created this twisted mix of love and fear and a desperate need to please her. He soaked up everything Augusta said. Psychologists would say her extreme views and the whole isolating vibe set him up to be a total psycho. He never learned how to talk to people normally, especially women. To him, they were all just evil sent to earth from the devil himself. On December 29th, 1945, at the age of 67, Augusta died from her long-time battle with cancer. When she died, all those years of being locked away and her crazy teachings sent Ed into a downward spiral. Augusta was all he knew. She never let Ed associate with anyone else. Without his mum to tell him what to do, Ed decided to recreate the only woman he ever really loved. You know where this is going? I know you do. Yeah. Gross. Ed's upbringing left him with a seriously twisted view of the world and relationships. When his mum passed, it triggered a sickening response that would soon leave the whole nation praying for it. What did Ed actually do? And how did the cops finally figure it out? Trust me, the answers, they're wild, all right? So we know Ed's been living this whole life in a bubble. And then boom, Augusta dies. And that bubble bursts. But here's the wild part. Nobody in Plainfield had any idea about the chaos brewing inside their creepily quiet neighbor. Ed tried to keep it together, but behind the awkward smile, he was totally losing it. He got super obsessed with death and the female body and spent hours diving into medical books and autonomy charts, trying to figure out something he just couldn't understand. The more he studied, the weirder things got. In a small town like Plainfield, people usually kept to themselves. Ed was always polite and, like I mentioned before, creepily quiet. He would tip his hat to ladies and help them by carrying their groceries. You would have never guessed that in his own mind, he was battling deep, dark thoughts. But you know, anything that comes after but is never going to be good anyway. But over time, his behavior started to get really erratic. He'd have these intense chats with himself, sometimes answering like he was channeling his mum's voice. Creepy. Then he'd start hanging around the local cemetery. Not just like 1 or 2 visits, he was there a lot. At first, people thought that he was mourning his mum, right? That's fair. I mean, nothing abnormal about that. You could almost feel sorry for him. But nah, there was way more to it than that. He was scoping out potential subjects for his twisted plans. As months dragged on, Ed's grip on reality started slipping. Neighbors began noticing weird noises and strange habits beginning to form. They probably just figured, oh, it's just Ed being Ed. Little did they know how far gone he really was. And then one night, everything just snapped. He couldn't handle it anymore. He missed his mum so much that he decided to do the unthinkable. Yep, you guessed it. He was going to dig up her grave. It's like he thought he could somehow bring her back. That is some serious Frankenstein shit. So that's what he did. He dug up Augusta's body and took it back to his farmhouse, keeping her remains in various forms, like preserving her head and her other body parts. Now, you might think that exhuming his own mother and taking her home is as low as someone can get, right? But for Ed Gein, it was just a warm-up. What drives a man to prowl cemeteries in the dead of the night? The answer is more chilling than you might expect. Picture this. It's a moonlit night in Plainfield. The wind whistles through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots. But there's something else moving in the shadows. It's Ed Gein, and he's on a mission. He had this whole thing planned out like some twisted movie. He'd scope out the cemetery during the day, noting which graves were fresh. Then, under the cover of darkness at night, he'd return with his toolkit. Digging up a grave isn't exactly a walk in the park. It's hard, sweaty work, and Ed would often be at it for hours. See, like, I didn't get this part because graves are deep, like really deep. That's a long way down, but Ed, he made it work. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way, right? Here's the really freaky, messed up part. He'd go into this weird daze-like state while he was doing it. It's like he was on autopilot, driven by some dark obsession that he just couldn't control. What was going through Ed's mind during all of this? Well, remember how I mentioned that he was trying to recreate his mum? It wasn't just any old grave that he was digging up. He specifically targeted graves of middle-aged women who looked like her. He thought that with the right bits and pieces, he could almost make a second her. Ed was really picky about his victims. He looked for bodies that had recently been buried within like the last few days of the funeral. The soil would still be soft and a little bit moist, making his job easier. And I'd hate to get gross here, but the bodies would be in better condition. Ed's activities spanned about 5 years, from 1947 through to 1952. He admitted to robbing 9 graves, but people believe that number was much higher. It's like he was building some kind of grotesque collection, each trip to the cemetery adding to his gruesome inventory. The question is, what was he planning to do with it all? 9 graves might seem like a lot, but for Ed Gein, it was barely enough to scratch his twisted itch. As his collection grew, so did his ambitions. Ever wondered what a serial killer does with his spare time? In Ed's case, he turned his home into a nightmarish craft project that would make even the bravest cops' stomachs turn. Ed's renovations quickly spiraled into the realm of the truly disturbing. Now, why on earth would Ed do this? Psychologists believe Ed was trying to create a woman suit so that he could become his own mother. He was so obsessed with Augusta that he literally wanted to crawl into her skin. To hide what he was doing, he tried his hardest to play it cool and blend right in. Ed was going about his day-to-day life, still doing odd jobs around the town, even babysitting his neighbor's children, where he would look after them in his own home. Can you imagine if one of those kids had wandered into the wrong room? As Ed's collection grew, so did his confidence. He started getting bolder with his projects. It wasn't just about preserving body parts anymore. He was creating his own personal museum of horrors, with every inch of that farmhouse filled with his gruesome handiwork. But here's where it gets really messed up. Ed started feeling like his materials weren't fresh enough. And that's when things went from seriously disturbing to downright putrid. What drove Ed to evolve from robbing graves to hunting the living? The answer lies in a small tavern on the outskirts of Plainfield, where one woman's disappearance changed everything. He was craving fresher materials. Ugh. I hate referring to his victims as materials, but that's what he called them. Horrible. Almost dehumanizing them. Ed started hanging around town more. his eyes searching for potential victims. The once harmless handyman had become a predator on the prowl. Imagine crossing paths with him, not knowing the dark, filthy thoughts going on in his mind. Whoa. During this time, Plainfield residents began to notice something weird was going on. A few people went missing here and there. Nothing major at first, just the occasional unexplained absence. But in a small town like that, whispers turn into rumors. Yet nobody expected Ed. Well, not yet anyway. His fantasies grew more intense with each day that passed. His mind was like a pressure cooker of disturbing thoughts, ready to explode at any moment. Then came the turning point, Mary's Bar, a tavern just outside of town, which was owned by Mary Hogan, a tough as nails lady in her 50s. Ed had been her regular for years, always sitting in the corner watching silently. In December 1954, Mary vanished without a trace. And guess who was there the night before? Yeah, Eddie Boy. Mary Hogan, the no-nonsense owner, was behind the bar doing her thing. And there, in his usual corner, was Ed, just watching. Always watching. This dude had been plotting his next move for weeks. He waited until closing time. When the last few stragglers stumbled out into the cold Wisconsin night, Mary was cleaning up, probably happy to just be heading home, totally unaware of what was coming her way. But then, bam, Mary was gone. The next morning, when Mary didn't show up to open the bar, people started to get suspicious. So while the town buzzed with rumors and theories, Ed was back at his farm, and not a single person thought to dig deeper into the quiet guy who kept to himself. Weeks turned into months, and Mary's case went cold. People started to forget and, just move on. But Ed, he was just getting warmed up. That first taste of killing had awakened something dark and hangry. Hungry in him. And now that he knew he could get away with it, who knows what he'd do next. While Plainfield was snoozing away, Ed Gein's twisted cravings were getting way out of hand. Neighbors started to notice little changes at first, but soon they became impossible to ignore. What was up with Ed that suddenly made everyone feel so uneasy? And why weren't they connecting the dots? After Mary Hogan's murder, Ed was strutting around town like he owned the place. On his face, he had this creepy smirk. This looks freaking wild. Crazy. Just gotta love those clown mouths. Oh yeah. Gotta love it. People were whispering about how he seemed different, more confident, but also off. His behavior got super weird. Like one time, Miss Johnson's car broke down and Ed offered her a ride home. She smartly said no, later admitting that his eyes gave her the creeps. Good call, Mrs. J. Another time, the postman caught Ed hanging around behind the post office after hours. He just mumbled something about a lost cat and bolted. Sketchy, right? As the months rolled by, Ed's obsession got stronger. He'd spend hours driving around town, following women home from work or the grocery store. Sometimes he'd accidentally run into them, striking up these bizarre conversations. It was like he was testing out how far he could push things before someone caught on. But nobody did. People just believed that his odd behavior was, well, Ed being Ed. Little did they know they were living next to a full psychopathic monster. You're probably going to hear a lot of background noise because my babies are in the shower next door and Dad's washing them, so it is what it is. This is my channel. Welcome. Then Ed found his next material, Bernice Worden, the owner of the local hardware store. She was in her late 50s and also had that no-nonsense kind of vibe that reminded him of his mom. So what did Ed do? He started hanging out at the store mall buying random junk just to be near her, to watch her. As Ed's obsession with Bernice grew, so did his horrific plans. So it was November 16th, 1957, just another chilly Sunday morning in Plainfield. Bernice had opened up her hardware store, totally oblivious that this was going to be her last day on Earth. That morning, Ed strolled into the store with his creepy smile. He chatted with Bernice about the usual stuff, all while checking to make sure they were alone. Then out of nowhere, he pulled out a 22 caliber rifle. In the chaos, Ed made a huge mistake. He left behind a receipt for a gallon of antifreeze with his name on it. That little piece of paper would end up being the key to crack the whole case wide open. Somehow, Ed managed to get Bernice's body out of the store and back to his farm without anyone seeing him. Remember, this is during broad daylight. It wasn't until later that day when her son Frank Worden swung by the store that the alarm bells started ringing. He found the place empty, blood on the floor, and the cash register missing. The police investigation picked up speed real quick. Ed's name kept popping up. People remembered seeing him at the store that morning. With all the evidence piling up against him, the cops headed out to his farm. They had no idea what they were about to walk into. They're expecting to find some evidence, maybe even Bernice Worden herself. But what they walk into is beyond their worst nightmare. The first thing that hits them is the smell, a sickly odor that makes their stomachs do somersaults. As they start searching the house, things go from bad to worst. At first glance, it looks like your typical bachelor pad. Messy, cluttered, you know the drill. But then they start noticing things, weird things. In the kitchen, there's a pot on the stove. Inside, a human heart. The officers stand there wondering if they're dreaming, but it's all too real, and it's just the beginning. As they continue their search, each discovery is more horrifying than the last. Lampshades made from human skin. Chairs upholstered with, well, you can guess. Ed's creations included bowls crafted from the human skulls, and even a pair of leggings made from human leg skin. Get this right, they even find a belt made from human nipples. Who even thinks of that? This is sickening. Like, imagine being invited over his house for a cuppa to find his human leather furniture set. That is the definition of nightmare fuel. Hey, the officers found body parts everywhere. In the fridge, in the drawers, even hanging from the ceiling like some twisted wind chimes. The next piece of evidence was enough to find him guilty on the spot, in my personal opinion. There, hanging like meat in an abattoir, was Bernice Worden's decapitated corpse. Each new find adding another layer to the growing horror of the situation. And Ed, he's nowhere to be found. They get the word that Ed's been spotted. They find him at the neighbor's house, just sitting there, calm as can be. When they arrest him, he simply says, "I guess you caught me." Like he's a kid caught stealing cookies, not a guy with a house full of human remains. During questioning, Ed's surprisingly chill, and he admits to killing Bernice Worden and Mary Hogan, plus robbing all these graves. He talks about it like he's describing his grocery list. The cops are freaked out, but Ed, he's just sitting there, asking for a slice of apple pie with cheddar cheese. Word of Ed's arrest spread through Plainfield like wildfire. People were totally in shock. This was Ed Gein, the guy who fixed your roof or babysat your kids. How could he be capable of something so horrific? At first, nobody wanted to believe it, but as the details started coming out, reality hit hard. The long-term effects of Plainfield were next level. Fear and paranoia took over. People started locking their doors for the first time ever. Parents were hesitant to let their kids play outside alone. Everyone began side-eyeing their neighbors, wondering what dark secrets they might be hiding. It was like the town lost its innocence overnight. Every Halloween, thrill seekers would roll into town, hoping to check out Ed's old farm or maybe feel some ghostly vibes. They didn't actually get to see the house because, well, it actually got burnt down not long after he was arrested. It's thought that some of the local teenagers, or maybe others who were fascinated by the whole thing, set it ablaze. Eventually, the house was left in ruins, and then the rubble was cleared away over the years. As time went on, Plainfield residents, while some packed up and left, unable to carry the weight of the town's dark history, those who stuck around had to find ways to move on, rebuild trust, and create a new story for their home. Ed Gein's psychological evaluation was about to flip criminal profiling on its head. A crew of psychiatrists geared up to dig into Ed's mind. The first findings were all over the place. Experts were debating if he had schizophrenia or some wild personality disorders. It was a mind-bending case that didn't fit into any neat boxes. This guy had built a whole fantasy world where he thought he could bring his mum back by making a woman suit out of real women's bodies. Just thinking about it gives me the creeps. The experts also unraveled Ed's complicated relationship with his mum. He both worshipped her and resented her, like a toxic mix of love and isolation that had been simmering for years. His lawyer, William Belter, entered a not guilty plea by reason of insanity. After months of intense analysis and debates that got pretty heated, by the way, the experts finally decided Ed Gein was deemed legally insane. This diagnosis changed everything. Instead of facing the death penalty or life behind bars, Ed was sent to Central State Mental Hospital. The decision stirred up some controversy. Some people felt like justice didn't happen, while others thought it was the only right call to be given how deep Ed's mental issues ran. Either way, the case of Ed Gein forever changed the game in criminal psychology, leaving us all with this unsettling question. How thin is the line between sanity and madness? Oh my god. That smells so good. That smells so... It's like cherry. You'd think Ed Gein chilling in a loony bin would be the end of the story, right? Nope. This is where his legend really took off. How did a guy who never left Wisconsin end up inspiring some of the most iconic horror characters ever? It all kicked off with the media frenzy. After Ed got arrested, newspapers were all over the gory details, calling him the Butcher of Plainfield and the human ghoul. People were horrified yet totally hooked. It was like a real-life horror flick happening right in their backyard. Writers and filmmakers saw something in Ed's story that just clicked. Maybe it was the idea that monsters can blend in, or that super creepy mother and son dynamic. Whatever it was, Ed Gein was about to become Hollywood's latest muse. Remember Psycho, that movie with the shower scene that made everyone freak out about bathing? Yeah, Norman Bates, inspired by Ed. The author, Robert Bloch, lived just 35 miles from Plainfield when Ed was arrested and turned that wild story into one of the most famous horror villains ever. What about Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Yep, that's another Ed Gein special. The whole killer wearing human skin thing came straight from Ed's real life nightmare. Isn't that wild? This guy from nowhere somehow became the blueprint for the movie monsters. Ed never stepped foot in Hollywood, but his fingerprints are all over the place. On July 26, 1984, Ed died while institutionalized from cancer and respiratory illness, where he was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery in Wisconsin. What a creepy story, right? Stories like that seriously give you the heebie-jeebies. Just put on this blazer and put some gel in my hair, which I'll have to wash out later because I'm not going to bed with this green gel in my hair. Anyway, thank you so much for hanging out with me, sis. If you loved this video, please don't forget to hit the like button. And if you really liked it, maybe you can hit the subscribe button so we can hang out again. Well, that's it from me. Until next Tuesday, have a safe and happy week. And remember, you take care out on those streets, girl. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, sis. You know, we can keep hanging out if you want to. All you have to do is tap this true crime and makeup playlist. Tap it.